We're going to change it up a little bit today, and instead of just looking at one specific event or one specific empire, we're going to look at an even smaller unit, a teeny tiny city-state in Greece called Athens. And we're going to be focusing on Athens over a pretty big period of time to look at a number of its super important accomplishments, starting on about the year 508 BCE, when Athenian democracy replaces the tyranny that came before it, and going through around 399 BCE, when the Greek rationalist philosopher Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth. We're going to start with the story of democracy, the form of government. And again, just to put us in context, we are focusing in on a teeny tiny city-state called Athens. It still exists. It's still called Athens in Greece. Remember that ancient Greece developed an incredibly rich trading culture because it was on the Mediterranean Sea and it had access to easy transport over water and a number of other civilizations around it. Lots of trade often leads to lots of ideas from different cultures to work with and adapt and build on, which can be really, really great for civilizations. Remember too that ancient Greece developed into independent city-states with different governments and a shared culture. Ancient Athens invented a ton of stuff that we take for granted today, including democracy, rational thought and Western philosophy generally, history as I am teaching it to you in terms of the study of observable causes and effects that can be explained and understood instead of being a story about things that happen because the gods willed them, drama, tragedies, epic poetry, and all of this really shaped ancient Athens into having its own golden age, an idyllic, often imaginary pastime of peace, prosperity, and happiness. We have to be careful when we look at golden ages in history because the title makes everything sound awesome, and not everything was awesome for everybody at the time. But still, it's a useful label to give a period of time that's really rich in culture and discovery, and it's worth poking around to see what promoted those kinds of things so that we can hopefully have golden ages again someday. A theme in world history is that often, in order for golden ages to be possible, you need to have a society with a stable government, a good amount of long-distance trade, and openness or tolerance to ideas from other cultures. We're starting with the political story, so let's remember some political terms. In Unit 2, we learned about limited and unlimited governments. Limited governments have rulers with limited power, right? Power limited by laws, the constitution, the rights of citizens, that sort of thing. In classical Europe, two kinds of limited governments were invented and existed for the first time, and they have been incredibly influential in our world, basically ever since. Ancient Greece developed Athens, and it developed a form of democracy called direct democracy, where citizens vote directly on laws. After ancient Greece, we're going to look at the Roman Republic, which is a representative democracy. So instead of voting directly on laws, citizens vote for representatives who represent their wishes and make those voting decisions for them. We live in a republic, and it was modeled off of the Republic in Rome. But even Rome's republic originally was modeled off of this ancient Greek idea of democracy coming from the root demo, the people, and kratia, the power or rule. Democracies are ruled by the people. These forms of a limited government contrast with unlimited governments. Unlimited governments have full freedom to act. They have power that is not limited by rights of the people or by written law. And they tend to be autocratic in leadership style. Autocracy, also an ancient Greek word, I think you're getting a theme, from the root self and the suffix to rule. It means one who rules by himself. So instead of rule by the people, autocracies are one person tells everybody what to do and then they have to do it. All of the classical empires were unlimited governments. They were all ruled by an emperor who had full authority to make decisions, and that authority was not limited by any sort of voting public or the rights of the people or any sort of written constitution. So all empires were unlimited, and we are going to look at the two civilizations who pioneered limited governments, Athens and Rome, starting with Athens. And here is where our key points for notes begin. Athenian democracy was a new idea in history. It was unusual. And it was a direct democracy in Athens. So again, that means government by the people, in which the people, citizens, vote directly on laws. Athenian democracy was also set up so that there was a separation of powers. There were three branches of government. What that means is no single group is making all of the decisions for the state. Much like we have a Supreme Court separate from a Congress, separate from the executive branch and the presidency. The idea is you want all three of those power structures to balance each other out. You don't want to give one of them too much power, because the fear in Athens was if you give one person too much power, power corrupts, they will take over. Athenian society was also special because it included the possibility of social mobility, meaning you could move up in the social hierarchy under certain circumstances. This is something that until very recently in history has been very rare. So Athens definitely stands out. In Athenian democracy, a poor man could wind up a political leader if he proved his merit, if he was able, if he had the skill. This emphasizes the duties and privileges of citizenship. Citizens could vote, and citizens had a responsibility to do so, to take care of their community. So this sounds pretty nice. It sounds very, very modern, right? Voting citizens. The catch is, who counted as a citizen in ancient Athens? We can ask how democratic Athens was, and actually we can ask that about many limited governments, because there isn't just a yes or no answer to those questions. Democracies exist on a spectrum. To answer this question, we can ask how much of the population can vote, right? Who counts as a citizen and who gets left out? And if we look at this first source, we see that men who were citizens could vote, but that was only about 12% of the population. Women couldn't vote, children of citizens couldn't vote, people from other Greek city-states couldn't vote, and slaves definitely couldn't vote. So a really small proportion of the population was actually making political decisions. We can also ask how limited the power of the ruler is. Is there a separation of powers? Is there a written constitution? And that can help us see how democratic a place is. In Athens, government was divided into three branches, kind of like ours: a legislature, a council, and a court. The legislature was the main governing body in Athens, and they made most of the important decisions. Any Athenian citizen could attend and vote in the legislature, as long as it was a man. And they met 40 times per year. The council was made up of 500 men chosen by lottery, and they served once a year. They served one-year terms. They made the day-to-day decisions of government. The court was made up of 500 men, over 30, who were chosen by lottery also, and they decided legal cases. So power was split up into separate branches of government. That makes Athens pretty democratic. However, not very many people could vote. So that kind of, kills the buzz on that a little bit. In a similar vein, it's always good to turn the mirror on ourselves, right? We live in a democracy, but how democratic are we by those standards? If we're looking at how many people can vote, I definitely encourage you to look up voter suppression on the American Civil Liberties Union website, because you'll see that actually, although a lot of people have the right to vote in this country, we can make it really hard for people to do that. It's not uncommon for states to make it difficult for certain portions of the population to vote because they know they're going to vote for one party over another. And if you've been paying attention to the news, I'm recording this in 2020, maybe you've seen really, really, really long lines to vote in predominantly minority neighborhoods, while primarily white neighborhoods have a pretty easy way to go vote that doesn't involve waiting for like 6-8 hours at a time. So voter suppression is real, and it's something that we should probably fix if we want to be a little bit more democratic. The other thing that we could look at as a criteria, right, was like how limited is the power of the executive? And again, recording this in 2020, we're at an unfortunately interesting moment in history where respect for our written constitution is dropping in a way that is measurable. Similarly, different branches of government, while normally they are supposed to check the power of each other, in recent history, that has not been happening in the United States. So, if you take a long view of history, we have a little work to do in order to become more democratic like we were in the not so recent past. Another thing we can look at is, are people equally represented in government? And in the United States, it turns out not so much. When you get to US history and gov class, you'll learn about the Electoral College and how we divide up representation. Every state gets 2 senators, for example, no matter how many people are living in that state. And that means that states with really teeny tiny populations actually are better represented in our government than states with huge populations. So something to keep in mind when we look at democracy anywhere else, we should also look at ourselves and judge ourselves by the same metrics. The second giant contribution that Athens made to Western civilization, to Western philosophy, well, actually it was philosophy, it's something called rationalism. Rationalism is a philosophy that is based on using reason and logic to understand the world, to make sense of where we live, to make sense of our lives, right? As opposed to believing things on faith or using religious explanations as the primary guide to action. Ancient Athens was a hotbed of philosophical thought, historically speaking. And the guy that began it all, the most famous, the person who is responsible for the way that we teach classes and Socratic circles and all the rest, was a philosopher named Socrates, who you've probably heard of even if you don't know about it yet. One of his most famous sayings is, "The unexamined life is not worth living." In other words, think about your life, otherwise what is the point? A couple of generations later, another Athenian philosopher, Aristotle, came about to kind of refine the rules of rational thought. And there's a quote from him on this slide too that really, really sums up the point of Greek rationalism. He says, "Be a free thinker and don't accept everything you hear as the truth. Be critical and evaluate what you believe in." It was good advice then, it's great advice now. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of the background on this rationalist philosophy because it's really kind of hard to understand what it is without knowing what its opposite is. You need a contrast sometimes to understand abstract ideas. So what follows is going to be story time. When you see a red arrow at the top right of the slide, that is the slide with the key points. But until then, just listen and enjoy. The ancient Greeks worshipped many gods. You've heard of them. You've read the myths. And each of these gods had a distinct personality. Ares was the god of war, for example, and he was responsible for determining defeat or triumph of opposing armies. Poseidon was the god of the oceans and earthquakes, and he was responsible for the voyages of sailors and the fates of entire villages. Aphrodite was the goddess of beauty and love, and she was responsible for the union of men and women. This aspect of Greek culture had a huge influence of Greek life. It was the primary focus. All major political decisions and scholarly calculations were in some way based on mystic religious rituals. If men wanted to go to war or make a sea journey for trade, they had to consult oracles or wait for omens, which are signs from the gods, like an eagle flying past with a serpent in its talons. They could throw chicken bones in a fire and watch how those bones cracked, and the cracks would reveal the future. Or they could sacrifice animals, which would please the gods and ensure their safety, according to their religious beliefs, of course. To use modern terminology, ancient Greek decision-making and truth-seeking was unscientific and irrational, at least by today's standards. When you have to make a decision, you probably don't throw a chicken bone in a fire, see how it cracks, and then make life choices based on that. That's because we are no longer like this, and if we no longer think like this, it's because of Greek rationalism. In opposition to these traditional Greek practices, Greek rationalism developed with the philosopher Socrates, who is considered to be the founder of Western thought. How rationalism developed is a longer story. When alphabetical writing reached Greece long before, around 700 BCE, it was the first gateway that opened up the possibility of way more complex thought. Epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey were written down, and this inspired a flowering of Greek literature and a general Athenian culture that was really invested in pursuing justice and truth and beauty and fame, and really thinking deeply about those concepts. And that alone inspired an extraordinary outpouring of poetry and drama, history and philosophy that defined the good life for generations of Greek and Roman citizens, and actually for us too. Medical and physical science began to take off, and a few bold thinkers started to imagine that just as citizens of the city ordered their lives by obeying laws that could be expressed in words, physical nature too maybe obeyed laws also. You'd get thinkers like Pythagoras, who was the first to believe that the earth was a sphere rotating around a central fire. The natural order of things could be expressed in numbers, and numbers were in fact reality. You got Hippocrates, a Greek doctor who believed that diseases had a physical cause. And you got Democritus, a Greek philosopher who developed atomic theory, believing cause and necessity. In other words, nothing comes out of nothing. Everything has a cause. This generated a ton of ideas that live on. Scientists and philosophers disregarded ideas about the gods of the past in their quest for truth and started to find the truth using the power of reasoning. That doesn't mean they weren't religious anymore. They just stopped using the gods as their primary source of finding truth in the world. This is Greek rationalism, the idea that humans can use their minds to solve problems. Thinking and discussing ideas are hugely important to this process, and their emphasis on debate and disagreement as productive ways to come to reasoned solutions will contrast with philosophies that we'll see dominant in other empires of the classical period that were very based on faith and obedience and just trusting. Socrates was the main guy for this, or the first anyway, and he was quite the character. Socrates got people to think critically by asking them questions until it was clear that the person knew less than they thought that they did. This was supposed to inspire people to fill in those gaps in knowledge and question their assumptions. The main idea is you know less than you think you know. A lot of what you think you know, you're actually basing on assumption or what other people have told you, but you haven't investigated it yourself. So think critically, always. He developed a method called the Socratic method for finding truth. And in classrooms around the country and around the world ever since, it's been the method that we use to teach and explore ideas. There are steps to it. The Socratic method involves first admitting ignorance. You can't learn stuff if you think you already know stuff. So admit that you don't know stuff and then you can learn stuff. 2, don't rely on tradition. That means just because people have believed something for a really long time doesn't mean it's true. 3, continuously question. Always ask yourself how you know what you think you know. 4, formulate your own opinions. Think for yourself. And then 5, test your opinions on others. Discuss ideas to see if what you've come to believe is actually true. Socrates ran into trouble in Athens by asking too many questions. Doing this made him a threat to people in power, and eventually he was put on trial and then put to death for corrupting the youth with his questions. His legacy, however, was not so easy to kill. His student, Plato, wrote a lot of these Socratic dialogues. Socrates didn't write anything himself. He left that to other people, and Plato was the guy who kind of picked up that slack. And his apology reveals how Socrates' rationalism conflicted with more traditional Greek beliefs and practices. Socrates was not the only philosopher who founded Western thought. He was the first, and then following him, people built on his idea. So Socrates argued that the truth is found by questioning the assumptions on which all things are based. He promoted the Socratic method of teaching by asking questions, which is what we do in class. He questioned Athenian values, Athenian laws, customs, religion, and then he was put on trial for corrupting the youth for teaching that there might be other gods other than the official ones that they worshipped at the time. He was found guilty, put to death. His student Plato was the first to establish, maybe it was the first university. There's a little controversy about calling it that, but he established something called the Academy where people could go and learn. And he wrote a book that was super, super influential in political thought called The Republic on the Ideal State. Aristotle, the third of the big three, was a student of Plato who studied everything, actually. He analyzed forms of government. He thought a lot about morality, like right and wrong. He wrote out a lot of formal logic, dealt with science, metaphysics, and importantly to history, he was the tutor of a guy named Alexander the Great, who would go on to conquer a lot of the Middle East. We're going to learn about him next. We also got history for the first time. Herodotus, the first historian to really explain human events in human terms without having the gods be the cause of everything. And Thucydides came after. Thucydides says that history is philosophy teaching by examples, and I really like that quote. So what is rationalism? Rationalism is using the power of reason, using logic. And logic is reasoning that follows rules, right? Like you can write logical statements as equations almost. In order to reason correctly, you have to start with premises or assumptions that are true. And then you have to question your assumptions, because if you start out with the wrong idea, then you end up with the wrong conclusion. It follows rules though. So rationalism is the opposite of faith-based thinking. As you go on in high school, you can also add a few layers to your study of rationalism. I think in English class, you learn about rhetorical fallacies or logical fallacies, which are flawed arguments that sound convincing but aren't actually a good way to get to the truth. We also layer on top of that human psychology. We have cognitive biases or flaws in the way that we think that can lead us to irrational conclusions. So, being a rationalist, following logic, it takes actually some mental discipline and some work, but it is mathematical, it is reliable, and the Greeks pioneered it. We're almost to our key points for the rationalism part, but not quite. To cycle back to what we've learned in the past, right? Most ancient societies saw social hierarchy as key to an orderly civilization, and those hierarchies were often legitimized by religion. In other words, a place's religion kind of put its stamp of approval on the way society was shaped and the way political power worked. In most classical civilizations, most empires, wanted populations kind of where that orange star is at the top right of that graph, right? They wanted people to take what they heard on faith and to obey the emperors. Ancient Athens really pioneered the opposite way of thinking that relied a lot on logic and resulted in a culture that valued questioning authority. So we arrive at our key points on Greek rationalism. While most classical civilizations used religion to encourage obedience to that civilization's leaders, often saying they were divinely chosen or had the mandate of heaven, Athens was different. It pioneered a different way of thinking that remains key to democratic government, and that is called rationalism. Rationalism is all about questioning and discussing ideas in order to find the truth. Athens was also democratic, second thing that was unique about it, and it was relatively socially mobile for the time, which means it was possible for a very talented poor person to develop a career in politics. Rationalism itself is a philosophy that promotes questioning received wisdom using reason, logic, and debate to find the truth. The classical Greeks did still have a religion, but they placed more emphasis than other civilizations on logic and observation. Socrates was the name that I want you to associate with this idea of rationalism. He was the first Athenian philosopher who emphasized questioning received wisdom and believed that truth was found by questioning the assumptions on which all things were based. So to wrap us up, we have philosophy and governments all in one chart. In terms of power, we have seen throughout this unit that empires, a form of unlimited government, preferred centralized rule, meaning the emperor had full power, and they were autocratic, meaning the emperor told people what to do and they did it. This contrasts with democracy, limited government, where instead of power being centralized around an empire, it's separated into different branches of government with democratic styles of rule. In other words, the people express their opinions by voting, and that's how government makes decisions. In terms of legitimacy, or the right to rule, empires claimed legitimacy based on a religious basis for their political power. In democracies, political power comes from voting citizens. Ideologies and philosophies are the toughest part to really get your heads around, and the contrast here should help. Empires tended to promote philosophies that valued faith and obedience. We've seen a few, right? We've seen Confucianism in the Han Dynasty, which emphasized social order by promoting filial piety and obedience to one's superiors, who in turn must act rightly and set a good fatherly example for the nation. We also saw the caste system in India, based on Hindu ideas about karma and reincarnation, fulfill the same purpose. The idea being you must fulfill the obligations of your caste to move up into the next life. Both of these are very collective ways of knowing the truth. Under Confucianism, you listen to other people, people who know better, your superiors, your elders. And that's how you figure out right from wrong. This contrasts with Greek rationalism, which is a lot more individualist. It's a philosophy that argues that people can use reason or logic to understand the world and to solve problems. Rationalism values debate, discussion, and questioning, and independent critical thinking. Societies, too, are pretty different. Empires tend to have very rigid social hierarchies, meaning there's usually not a clear way up in class. Democracy, on the other hand, tends to value some social mobility. Like in ancient Athens, it was possible for a poor man to have a political career. Both of these styles of rule have some costs and some benefits. For an empire, the benefits are it's easier to rule a society of people who follow your orders on faith. So for the emperor, these philosophies that emphasize hierarchy and obedience are really convenient. For the people, when you have one person with centralized rule, it's easy for that one person to make decisions fast, which can be pretty convenient in times of crisis. On the downside, it relies on that one centralized ruler to make good choices. If the ruler has bad ideas, everybody in this empire is in trouble. For democracies, the benefits and downsides are a little different. Benefits can be having a culture of questioning and debate can prevent people with power from making terrible decisions. However, the downside is that democracies tend to be a little bit slower to act because if you have to vote before making decisions, that takes longer. Also, as we've probably seen in the news with like this COVID fiasco and some people refusing to wear masks, too much individual thinking without the logic you need to do it properly can cause some pretty big social problems for everybody. And finally, influence of all this. Greek rationalism was hugely influential in the West. It has provided an alternative way of understanding the world to the broader trend of religious belief and faith and obedience that tends to be the norm in history. In the short term, Greek thought influenced the Roman Empire pretty directly. And then in the slightly longer term, Greek thought, especially the science and math part of the story, spread east into Central Asia through the conquests of Alexander the Great, who we're going to study next. In your classrooms, rationalism should have a huge influence. Classrooms should be places where you behave rationally, where you're critical thinkers. And your teachers probably, mostly throughout your life, have taught you by asking questions. And while you answer those questions, you discover the limitations of what you know so that you can then add to it. Tune in next time for Alexander the Great.